And we are live. Welcome, everybody, to the Autism in Black live show. We are discussing a very important topic today. We are talking about systemic racism and school. So, I am Maria Davis Pierre. I am a licensed mental health counselor, and I am the founder and CEO of Autism in Black Inc. Our mission is to support Black parents who have a child who is autistic through various means. And we also train organizations, schools, hospitals on how to be more culturally responsive to the Black disability community. And I am joined by two of my Philly girls. You know, I love them so. You've seen me work with both of them in various ways. So I'm going to introduce Naomi, and she's going to tell you a little bit about herself.
Hello. My name is Naomi Studevant, and I am an education.
Can you hear her?
Can you hear? Okay.
I can hear you.
I am an education and behavioral health consultant. Our mission, Advocacy Unlimited's mission, is to educate, encourage, and empower parents to advocate for their children, and we support them by modeling. We go in and we support parents in meetings, and we educate them on how to navigate the education system so that eventually they're able to go in and do it with confidence, even if they just have us there for backup. Thanks for having me.
I cannot hear for some reason. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I can't hear you. Okay, hold on. Let me see. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Let me see. Yep, can't hear you still. I'm going to exit and try to come back in, and hopefully it doesn't mess with the live.
Okay. I guess, Naomi, maybe you know the answer to this, but are people able to attend if they don't have Facebook?
It's on YouTube as well. She's YouTube Live. If they go on to Autism in Black on YouTube.
Okay.
Oh, hi, Blair.
Let's try this again. Let me see if I can hear you, ladies.
Hey.
Nope. Hold on. This is crazy. Technology, I tell you. Hold on.
It's always something when it's technology involved, especially lately. Yeah. I think it's like technology is like on overload as well as we are.
Yeah.
Almost as much as we are. Technology said, I had enough of y'all. They having us every once in a while. Now everybody's on constantly. I think that's what also was happening even on my end. When I started looking, it seemed like even lately the internet has been slower. Just everything is just not what it used to be.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's not used to sustaining this system.
Oh, Blair's from Washington. Hi, Melinda.
Oh,
thank you.
That's awesome.
Yes. Melinda, where are you from? Yes, tech is very crazy. So we can hear Maria. Maria just couldn't hear us. So she's trying to figure out what's going on her end.
Roanoke,
okay. On it, yeah.
Awesome.
Hi, Kashawn.
Who's able to show us or see us, let us know where you are.
Oh, okay, another Philly person.
Hey, Philly.
Yeah, North Carolina. Hello. Keisha. All right, Marissa, physical therapist. Yes.
Hey, Naima.
We got someone else from Austin, Texas.
I think this is the most powerful part of technology, is the ability to connect with people all around the country, as well as all around the globe. And we have Canada.
Yes.
Perfect timing.
Yes. Georgia. Yes. I think that's what I like most, especially even during quarantine. Like I'll keep saying, I feel like the silver lining has been that we've all been forced to use technology in different ways. And it's actually increasing some people's business. It's actually increasing a lot of people's reach as well, because it's showing us that the things that we felt like we could only do in person, we're starting to see that we can actually do virtually as well. Yeah. So it's actually been beneficial in a few different industries, different people that I've talked to.
I agree.
How are you guys feeling about it? Australia.
Yeah, I think that's been the highlight of mobilizing the resistance and the social justice work that's surrounding education, police brutality, all of these forms where you're able to share forms of liberation across space and time. There are no borders or boundaries to how far we can reach.
Right. Absolutely.
Hi. Sorry about, I'm telling you guys, something is going on with technology. It's trying to ruin us, but we're not going to let it ruin us tonight.
No. We've been getting to know the audience.
Good. So I know everybody has introduced themselves. So this is Mauli's website that you can go to, and this is Naomi's as well.
I actually did not introduce myself. We were waiting for you to come back. I guess it would have made sense to. But hello, everyone. My name is Mauli. I'm also from Philadelphia, as Maria mentioned. I am the owner of an organization called the Key Consulting Firm. Within the Key Consulting Firm, our mission is to transform the psychological and educational well-being of Black children by eradicating injustices and inequities that currently persist in educational systems. Mostly, we are striving to make sure that Black children understand their deep-seated potential and remove the barriers that block them from understanding their capabilities. Professionally, I'm a school psychologist as well as a behavior analyst, and I use my training in both areas to, in 2 words, liberate Black children. Well, 3 words. Liberate Black children.
Right to the point. That's how we like it. So you know why we are all here. We're here to talk about systemic racism in the school. So we're going to go ahead and jump right into it. Because of our technical difficulties, and I am very mindful and respectful of everybody's time. So if you have questions as we're talking, please make sure to comment, because as you know, I will just put those comments right on the screen and we'll answer them. So we're going to go ahead and get started with social emotional learning. First, let's just acknowledge that curriculum in the school system is whitewashed. And what we mean by that is there is no cultural responsive pieces to it. So it kind of puts our children, our Black children, at a disadvantage because they're not understood when their responses aren't well. So who wants to go first and talk about that?
I think we missed part of what you said, Maria. There was the last piece of your sentence. You mentioned that the social emotional learning that we currently have in schools is not socially responsive, therefore, or culturally responsive, therefore it's putting Black children, and then it went out. So you had a mic drop, we couldn't hear it.
Oh, nobody can hear now?
We can't. She must not be able to hear
us
again. She can't hear us again.
Hold on. Let me see. You two ladies continue to talk because I think they can hear you. They just can't hear me.
Okay.
So can you kind of start us off on that when it comes to the social emotional learning?
Yeah. So the big part of social emotional learning is the social component. And so we learn from our environment how we should interact with other people. And when you come from different cultural spaces and backgrounds and experiences and communities, what's socially acceptable in your community may differ from another community. But currently, right now, we're in our school systems and in the mental health field, we build practices around what social emotional learning is by defining it through the lens of whiteness in America. And therefore, children who are not white or are not as close to mainstream heteronormative cisgender male whiteness, then they fall on the margins and they're not going to be able to be, they're going to be categorized as problematic because they're not falling in line with this particular system.
So for me, just to let the audience know, I have lots of experience in behavioral health, more so in a direct care realm. So Molly is the clinical mind here. And so for me, a lot of times I understand the clinical, right? But I'm more so along the lines of putting it to practice, right? So what does it look like in the classroom? What does it look like with the people who are interacting with these children? And a lot of times what it turns out to be and what it looks like is that when we have in these schools teachers who are mostly white and they are teaching and have in their classrooms children who are Black, they have a hard time taking into consideration certain triggers for some of these children, some of the issues and concerns they're coming into the classroom with, and the discipline and the reaction, and then there becomes this lack of empathy when interacting with these children. And so when it comes to these children and they're coming into the classroom with the poverty, with lack of food, lack of sleep, just so many different things that they're coming in there with, and they're not treated as human beings, for one. Oftentimes we'll talk more about it, but just the fact that Black children are, any type of emotion that is shown is seen as a problematic behavior, and that child is then labeled as a problematic child versus, hey, what's going on? Did anything happen at home? Are you feeling frustrated? Let's talk about this. Let's understand it, which is something that a lot of their white counterparts will get. They'll get that pull to the side or phone call to mom. The phone call to mom will be more so, hey, I noticed that such and such was having a rough day today. Is everything okay? Whereas a Black child, it's discipline. And when a parent receives a phone call, it's for disciplinary reasons. It's, I can't believe they were acting like this and they were doing this and it's a problem. And that's the difference that we tend to see when it comes to that social emotional learning side.
Yeah, one of the big things you touched on is perception of how a particular behavior is observed. And so we do have a huge problem in our school systems around bias. And it's the same type of bias that we're seeing in the medical field as well as what we're currently protesting in the policing field. And it's really, how do you view the person that's in front of you? And for our conversation, because we're talking about children, how do you view these children? Do you view them as children? Do you view them as people? Or do you view them as something else potentially dangerous? And unfortunately, we know based on lots of data and just our times in schools. I've been in schools in Philadelphia and the DMV area, and the problem persists across state lines throughout the country, where when Black children are observed, when Native American children are observed, Indigenous children are observed, Latinx children are observed, they are seen as a lot more dangerous, a lot bigger, a lot more knowledgeable about dangerous behavior or adult topics than other students. And unfortunately, when that happens, they're being harshly punished and ineffectively disciplined in schools, or ineffectively taught some of these social emotional skills. Particularly when we talk about preschool. Preschoolers do not have many of the social emotional skills that we expect people to have, adults to have, because they're so young. If you think about preschool, 3 and 4-year-old children, they're so little. We're supposed to teach them that. But we see from what's happening currently in school, the expectation is different for them. They're expected to be able to self-regulate. But when they don't, we see some of the things that happen. I wish Maria was here, because some of it, unfortunately, that was in the media was from Florida, and children being handcuffed and taken to mental health facilities or police stations, things of that sort.
Yes, absolutely. And that's such a huge part of it, right? Is making our way, like unveiling those different layers of what's going on and the why it's happening. And like you said, Molly, is that you're supposed to teach them the way that they're supposed to behave. So if you feel like, what I've seen in so many classrooms and so many schools, I've walked down hallways and I can hear teachers screaming at the top of their lungs from down the hall. But you're screaming to tell the kids to stop screaming. So again, you're not, practicing what you're not leading by example. And so, yes, when we're even talking about children who are 3 and 4, if they're not being taught at that early age that if there's a concern, if you're frustrated, if you're angry, if you're sad, that it's okay. And here's the person that you can talk to about it. Here's someone that cares about your feelings. And they're not going to tell you to sit down and shut up when you try to say, hey, this person is trying to hurt me, or this is happening. We give our children so many mixed messages. On one hand, we'll say, don't hit, don't do this, don't do that, tell somebody. Then when they tell, we say, or put their hand up to tell, we say, sit down, shut up, wait, don't do that. So what are they supposed to do at this point? We're not teaching them how to express themselves in an appropriate way, in a therapeutic way.
Yes, I agree. And that leads us right into the perceptions of Black parents and students, and how we are perceived by the staff before we even, can introduce ourselves and let them know who we are. The perceptions that are against us, as Marley was saying, as soon as preschool, they see our Black boys as aggressive, they're seeing the parents as loud and aggressive. I posted a post about the stigmas against us parents. They're thinking that we're loud, that we don't know what we're talking about. We lack intelligence. We don't care. We're not there. So they're having all of these stigmas and microaggressions against us, and they've already have set the tone and the stage for how this interaction is going to be because of their perceptions that they come in with.
Yeah, I want to add one other additional piece that I think doesn't get enough attention from the media and from people in the field of education, because we do know that unfortunately, Black children are just suspended and expelled at a rate that's unacceptable. But it's across gender groups. And so a lot of the data looks at gender binary, boys and girls. And we know with boys in preschool, the rate is about 48% of suspensions are Black boys. But for all of the boys. But unfortunately, what we don't talk about enough is the fact that suspension for preschoolers across girls, 54% are Black girls. And so there's a crisis that's happening across all of the gender groups. And when we see the numbers, it just highlights that this is a problem that we need to really address, because it's leading these very young children to very poor outcomes.
Yes, agreed. I mean, you know, you guys were saying, you know, the standards for our children are unrealistic. So when they're unrealistic, they can't even begin to even meet them. And that's because of the perceptions of how schools and staff and teachers see our children. They automatically see our children as more mature. They see our children as children who can take it and get over it and work through it. They don't give our children even a chance to have feelings, because if they have feelings, then, oh, that's a problem, because, you know, they're aggressive then, you know. So they have all of these barriers that they have to, you know, get across just to even learn like their peers are learning, you know. So when these perceptions are getting in the way, we have to think about, you know, am I seeing this child is older than they should be? You know, my twins are 4 and were in preschool this last year, and my son was being seen as like an 8-year-old, you know, being treated much older than a 4-year-old, you know, with early birthdays, in the youngest in the preschool class. You know, that's how they're being perceived. So we have to make sure that we're not looking at the children older than what they should be, and having realistic goals and expectations. Because if your expectations for a 4-year-old are someone who's in 5th grade, they will never meet your bar, and you will always have an issue with it.
Right. And that's what, even with the perception of the parents, right? So in our light, you know, the conversations that we have had, it's parents who don't know how to really articulate certain concerns, or don't know how to navigate the system, are pushed off as, you know, uneducated, you don't understand, you can't figure it out. But then there's those of us who are highly educated in the field, highly experienced in the field. And when we go into the room, we're looked at as cocky and aggressive. So it's like, no matter what, there is no winning as a Black parent. It's either you're unintelligent and angry, and, you know, or you're too aggressive and to think that having some bit of self-esteem and self-worth makes you too cocky for some people. The fact that, you know, I can go in, and again, it doesn't matter if someone next to me has half of the education that I have, half of the experience. If they're white, everybody looks to them to speak and not to me to speak. And if I do speak, I'm a passionate speaker. You guys will see that as we talk. So, I talk like I do. I get, you know, my voice, and again, I come from a loud family too. So my voice starts to escalate. But it doesn't matter what we're talking about, right? We could be talking about the stars, the moon, and rainbows. If I'm loving that right now, I'm going to have that same energy. But when I go into these meetings and I am passionate about children getting what they need and getting the supports they need, I'm aggressive. I'm angry. All of these things, just trying to get my point across. Whereas it's fine for them to bully and be demeaning and be derogatory towards myself and the parents, but me standing up for us becomes aggressive.
Yes. And you know, that is the experience with me and my husband. You know, as all of you know, I am a licensed therapist. My husband is a physician, and they still don't look at us as professionals. You know, they still don't trust our judgment with our child, who, even if I wasn't a licensed therapist and he wasn't a physician, we are still the expert in our child because we know our child, you know. So they look at us from a different standpoint, and it is because we're Black, you know. When we go in there, we're the only Black people that are at the table. You know, I had to hire an attorney just to get stuff done with my child's IEP. Now, I was saying the same thing my attorney was saying. But because my attorney is an attorney, they were listening to her. But I was saying the exact same thing. I knew the laws, and I knew how to advocate for myself, and I knew I needed to get somebody to come in, even though she is also Black, and they probably have an issue with that, but it's not my problem. But yes, it's the perceptions that are set up against us. If I raise my voice just a little bit, I'm an angry Black woman. But if a white woman does the same thing, she's passionate about the topic. She's passionate about advocating for her kid. But I can't even go in a meeting a certain way because they're going to then stop even listening to what I'm saying, because now they're all, oh my God, she's getting too loud. She's getting too aggressive. So these are things that we have to constantly think about when we're interacting with the staff. These are things that our children have to actually think about when they're interacting with the teachers, because if they do something of a similar behavior, then they're seen as, that's a problem child. So these are the issues that we're talking about when we're trying to just navigate the system, and it's not fair to us and it's not fair to our children.
Yeah, I think as an educator or someone who's in the field of serving people as a practitioner, we have to be mindful of the language we use to talk about our children as well as parents. And so if we're calling parents difficult, because Naomi, you mentioned this earlier, you really can't you're either wrong or wrong when you're Black.
Mm-hmm. And yes.
Using implicit bias. Either you're not engaged enough or you're a difficult parent. And if we're trying to use that type of language, like, oh, this parent doesn't care about their kid because they weren't able to attend IEP meeting, even though it's in the middle of the day and they have to go to work and they're their own breadwinner. We don't think about those things. We just say they don't care about their kid. Or if they are voicing their opinion and they're like Naomi and I from Philly and they just, we talk passionately, then they're a difficult parent. And so we have to be mindful, like, how are we talking about the families of the students we work with? Then how are we talking about the students then? Because it's not just the mom that we're saying is difficult or the parent. We're also saying that this child, we probably perceive the child the same way.
Exactly.
So how does that lead to the rest of our behavior?
Exactly. So
mentioned that diagnoses stage and how difficult that is in navigating that space. We shouldn't make getting the help you need this difficult. We have to really think about that as clinicians.
It's the diagnosis stage for everybody who are, you've heard my story of what I had to do to get a diagnosis. And it's actually ridiculous that I had to go through all of that just to get my daughter a diagnosis that everybody knew she had, and can't even look at me or my husband who can diagnose, autism in children and trust his judgment. Can't listen to the person that does therapy and looks at, these characteristics, but still having to go through all of this, not trusting their colleague to know that he wouldn't just be pulling stuff out of the air and saying, yeah, she's autistic. No, there are reasons behind that. So having to sit in a colleague's office for a week just to get my child a diagnosis is ridiculous, because with other parents, they're not, and I'm talking about white parents, they don't have to do those things. That's why we have this gap that exists in our children getting diagnosed, because a lot of parents don't have the time to sit in an office for a week to get a diagnosis. So Kalandra,
I'm sorry. I just want to say, don't forget the other reason that you can't get a diagnosis is because we're trying to stop you from getting that check that you so badly want, because you want to get your child diagnosed as autistic. Don't forget about that.
I'm still trying to figure out this check they're talking about, because look, listen, it is not cheap, with these therapy services, medical services. So when y'all figure out that check that I am so badly trying to get, please let me know, because a girl could use some of these extra funds around here. So when you find the check, let me know. But
it's like, what is it? $100,000 a year more to have a child with a different ability.
So yes, we're looking at out-of-pocket expenses. So for us, our insurance doesn't cover anything. Well, they haven't covered anything. So I have just stopped even interacting with them because it causes me so much stress to have to sit on the phone. And, I know I come from a place of privilege in being able to pay out of pocket for these expenses because a lot of people can't, but it is not cheap paying for things that cost more than my mortgage, for my child. Yes, she needs it and I'm going to do it. But the fact that we have to do so much just to get these services is ridiculous. So yes, when y'all talking about this check, let me know where I can sign up, because y'all talking about this big money and I'm still looking for it. But Kalandra was saying she just had to remove her 6-year-old from a school because she was developing anxiety because the teachers have an unrealistic expectation of maturity. And I can completely understand that. Malia has anxiety as well, and perfectionism and wanting to do it right. And because the school, which is just going right into our next topic, teachers lack training, they don't really know how to address certain issues. And when it comes to our children, they're not even thinking about mental health diagnosis. They're not even really thinking about how their categorization is impacting them, within the school system. So it's so much against our children that they're having to go to go through. But teachers and the trainings they receive we need to do better. we just need to do better across the board. We know teachers lack training. We know that they're not required, to get certain trainings when it comes to being knowledgeable about mental health, being knowledgeable about being culturally responsive to the children. My child goes to a school that is diverse across the board with the students. However, the faculty and staff is not as diverse as the students that attend there. So it makes you wonder how they're teaching the children when they can't quite understand, where these children are coming from. And if their expectations are things that they grew up with, then my children are not going to meet those expectations either, because they're not understanding from a cultural standpoint where my children are coming from. But we know that is just not a teacher issue. As me and the ladies have discussed before, we know there's a bigger issue at hand, that principals don't put the effort or the priority into getting these certain trainings. We know the district doesn't put the priority into teachers getting this training. And in Florida, my child could be being taught by somebody who doesn't even have a degree in education, who doesn't have any training in special education. So there's so many factors at play that, my child is already, 10 steps behind, one, because she's Black. So that's the first thing they're seeing. And then we're looking at being autistic, having anxiety and things like that.
Absolutely. And that's the thing. The training is just from beginning to end. Like you said, when it comes to like the cultural biases, it's like, for me, the message has to be that as teachers, even though we know that it's going to take so long before there's actual guidelines to say this is what you have to do, this is what you have to learn, but it's like, why not take it upon yourself to learn these things, to seek these things out? So again, any of you who are here watching this and you are an educator, you have taken the first step, because this is what we seek out the information on your own, because you're not necessarily going to get it from the administrators. So in order to, like, one of the things that just doesn't sit right with me, right, is that anybody that works with kids, what you see is that when you have a positive rapport with a child, they make your life so much easier. Your life is so much easier. So why not learn these children? Why not figure out how to connect with them and build a rapport? Because it'll make your teaching experience that much easier. Why keep making it so difficult? So continue to search out information like this and do your own trainings.
Yes.
Yeah. I think so. I'm a big advocate for teachers. And I think, unfortunately, the way our system of education works isn't designed well. And unfortunately, teachers often get the brunt of the blame for what's happening in schools. But when you look at teaching as a field and the training that teachers get in their educational coursework, in their college or university or institution, it doesn't have the skills they need to be effective in the classroom. And so it's almost a setup to fail to some degree. There isn't a training in mental health. I know someone in the audience mentioned that their state of North Carolina is requiring that teachers get mental health training. That's definitely needed. We have children who are coming in with significant adversity or trauma exposure. And the people who are with them the most don't have the skills to address trauma. It's not, they just haven't been taught because we as a system haven't required that as a part of their training. Even understanding behavior. I studied behavior for 3 years, and then I continue to study it after that for certification and credentialing. Teachers maybe take part of a class, but they're required to manage the behavior of 30 children at a certain time. We need to change how our curriculum is designed. The other thing is making sure that we're using anti-racist curriculum. That's another issue that's not embedded in the teaching force from when they're in college that needs to be a part of it. And then the other thing is we have a system that doesn't value teachers. So we have teachers who are completely burnt out, underpaid, overstretched. And we know that there's a huge connection between burnout and stress and just being unable to keep your daily needs or your physical needs met and implicit bias. So when we see people who are using excessive force or just not responding well, they're in high stress and have limited resources. And that's just not a good combination, especially when you're working with small children. And additionally, when you're working with children with different abilities, because they're going to display behaviors that we would consider difficult. But But how do we respond is our responsibility. It's not their responsibility to respond to us. How do we respond to them is our responsibility as a professional.
Right. And that's a good point. Because with mental health in general, when we're looking at diagnosis and treatment, that is also very whitewashed. And it's also a systemic racism problem within the mental health system. You know, when we're looking at the characteristics of anxiety and depression and many things, PTSD that our children may very well come back to school with because of this pandemic, because of the racism that, you know, everybody just found out about in 2020. Because of that, our children are going to be coming in with these things. A lot of these children's family members have died, you know, and that's something they're newly experiencing, you know, and for especially our children who have disabilities, who are autistic, you know, their way that they display anxiety and depression is different. Add in the fact that they're Black, and we all also display these mental health diagnoses differently. It is so imperative that you're making sure your schools know this, that they're getting training in this, because depression and anxiety in Black people look like aggression. You know, it looks like a meltdown. You know, it looks like all of these behaviors that are problematic, when in fact it's us trying to navigate through depression and anxiety, because we also know how society sees us anyway. So we have to push through our mental health issues just, you know, to function in society. So we need to be making sure that our schools are knowledgeable on this, because our kids are very well going to come back to school with anxiety, with depression, with PTSD. So you need to be making sure that everybody is getting these trainings, because it's imperative at this point, especially for our Black children who display these mental health diagnoses differently from white children.
Right. Yeah, I think that's the biggest call to action. When we go back to physical school, whenever it happens in September, August, next year, it doesn't matter. We have to have a conversation around trauma-informed care when we go, because even as adults, this was traumatizing. I'm speaking for myself. I was traumatized by the pandemic, and like even going outside was scary. seeing people with half their face. All of these things has really been scary. I mean, we can even think about the times, I don't know if this happens to you ladies, but I'm watching TV and people start hugging and I'm like, oh, you shouldn't hug. And I have to remember this is prior to COVID-19. I'm an adult and I understand that, but think about children who don't have the developmental capacity yet to understand things the way we do. How are they interpreting things? How is it impacting their emotional well-being? So go back to the way we were, because it wasn't working in the first place, especially for Black children. It wasn't working, the educational system. We definitely can't go back again because it wasn't working for children who have trauma exposure. It just wasn't.
And Joy says, go ahead.
Joy, that's a great point. And that's what I was going to say is that all of this, when it comes to the counseling, I remember being in schools. And again, just when you go into certain neighborhoods, there's a lot of violence in the neighborhoods, right? And the thing is, people know this, but it's like we still don't account for it when we're dealing with these children. So these children are walking by on their way to school, the same spot that their brother was killed in just last week, and they have to pass that every day to go to school. And I remember like reaching out and saying to the school, listen, at this point, there's battles between families in the same neighborhood, and all these kids go to school together. And so you have all these different children experiencing grief, and the only place that they're all at the same time is school. And so schools have to, yes, education when it comes to the foundation of the literature and the mathematics is so important. But guess what? It can't even penetrate until we deal with the trauma that they're dealing with on a regular basis. So we have to, at this point, incorporate those things into the curriculum, incorporate counseling and group therapy into the school day in order for these kids to even get to the point to be able to learn. And I just wanted to give you guys a quick example of when it's like those implicit biases that teachers carry. I remember there was one child in a school in Germantown, one of the roughest areas in Philadelphia, especially at that time. The behavior was bad, right? Lots of behaviors. And please note what I just said. The behavior was really bad, not the child. The behavior was really bad. And the teacher, the way that she was reacting to the child, we all had a meeting. So at that time, my position was an education resource specialist. So in the meeting, we're telling the teacher about this child's situation and her home life and everything that she went through. And this white teacher, broke out in tears. She stopped at the table because now that she knows this child's story, she feels like crap for treating her the way that she did. But again, that's why it's your job that when you see these behaviors, you do not write this child off as a bad child. You look at these behaviors as a form of communication because they don't know how to articulate their feelings. They don't know how to express it. And so they do so in behaviors, and you have to peel it back to get to the bottom of it.
And with counselors, being in the school, that should be a priority. However, mental health across the board is not a priority here in America. So because of that, there is hardly any schools who actually have a mental health practitioner within the school system. There is a guidance counselor, but know that guidance counselors or school counselors are trained differently than a mental health counselor, because I think they switch the term to guidance counselors or school counselors for a lot of people. So know that your child who is going to see their guidance counselor, who is trained to help them with their grades and see what they're making and things like that, is not trained to help them with mental health issues. So that's why it is imperative, especially now as I continue to make it known that it's going to be quite different when our children return to school. And we need to make sure that our schools are equipped to do so. I think they have here in Palm Beach County have made an initiative to have one mental health counselor per school, which, is a start, but it definitely isn't enough, because when we're thinking about one therapist per everybody in that school that is going to be coming back with issues, and then we have our special education portion of it whose issues are completely different, that are going to be displayed differently, we know that they're just not going to be enough to handle everybody in that school. Is it a move that they're making in the right direction? Yes. Do they need to do more? Yes. And by more, that means us as parents, as professionals, advocating, lobbying for more mental health in the school system. We need to make it a priority, especially for our most at risk population, which would be Black students, because they're the most at risk. They're the ones who are going to be misdiagnosed across the board. They're going to be the ones that are misunderstood across the board. And when we're thinking about these things, we need to think about them in the terms of changing these policies.
Yeah, I think there's a resource I want to share with a lot of the people who are viewing. A lot of people also may be from Philadelphia, so this may be helpful. But Philadelphia redid the original adverse childhood experience study. And when they completed the study, they included racism as a adverse childhood experience, which is important, and it's long overdue. They also included neighborhood violence. And so when you think about cities who are similar to Philadelphia in its amount of violence, we have to account for that. And so, wow, you put that up, evaluation assessment. There is an evaluation. There's an assessment that we are using, which is really measuring trauma exposure for the students in our class, and just a screener for how much adversity they're experiencing. Because when we're seeing kids who come into school with some behaviors that we deem undesirable, we have to wonder, is there trauma exposure? And we don't do that at the back end. We should do that proactively.
Yes. Definitely agreed. And that segues right into evaluations and assessments and what you need to know about them. A lot of us are like, yes, let's, go for the evaluations and go for the assessments. And while I'm all for them as a therapist, I am also knowing that they are extremely biased and they are not set up for Black kids, because, again, I'm going to keep reiterating this, mental health in the DSM was not made. It was made for white men, when we're just gonna throw that out there. So, this is a barrier for our children. If evaluators who are evaluating our children are not getting culturally responsive trainings, if they're not understanding that piece, and then they go in and evaluate and assess our children, know that their biases will show up. When we're thinking about biases, we have to know that we're not always aware of them. We're not aware of our biases until something comes up against it. And then we're like, oh, but you're wrong. It's not me that's wrong. You're the issue. What I've learned is correct, So we have to look at it in that standpoint. If your evaluator has never had a thorough, culturally responsive, anti-racist, culturally competent, whatever you want to phrase it, if they've never had a thorough course in that, trust and believe that their evaluations and assessments have some sort of biases to it. And that's why our children are often misdiagnosed. That's why Black children are often given a behavior diagnosis or categorization in the school system, rather than putting them in the appropriate categories. That's why our children are put in that also emotionally disturbed category, which just makes me sick to my stomach, because it's not even a mental health diagnosis. That's something for another day. But just know that, when we're thinking about these evaluations and assessments, we have to know to a point that they are biased and they're missing that cultural component, so we need to make sure that as parents, when we're seeing the evaluations, that we do challenge it if it's not correct. They should be having a portion where you have a parent input anyway within the evaluations, and you need to be making sure that you're putting what you see at your house what you see your child do. Because as we know, our children act differently in different spaces, but you also need to be making it known that if they're putting emotionally behavior disturbed and you have a medical diagnosis of autism, somebody wrong. And it's not the person who has the diagnosis of autism. It's probably that person who's trying to put your child in that emotionally behavior disturbed class. So just be informed on these evaluations and assessments. And Mauli is actually a school psychologist and a BCBA, and she does evaluations and assessments. So she can, talk more about the biases within those assessments.
Yes, so the standardized assessments that we currently use, particularly the cognitive assessments, which in layman terms measure IQ, those have been and continue to be historically biased. When we look at the history of how those assessments arrived to the United States, it was very anti-Black, and it was not for the advancement and support of Black people and other people of ethnically marginalized communities. And so that's important. They try to make them less biased, but there is an area of bias. For parents, it's important to understand that the school psychologist you will work with, or the psychologist or the physician, they should be looking at your child from a very holistic framework. And so while we do have to use the cognitive assessment, unless we live in California, because California does not use cognitive assessments on Black students because of a lawsuit that happened a long time ago. If you want to study someone who has really studied cognitive assessments on Black students, look up Asa Hilliard. He's, the GOAT of school psychology. So across the country, we use cognitive assessments to test students. But even though we're using that measure, there's a lot of other forms of data collection that we can use. So Maria, like you mentioned, the parents' input should be included. We should do an extensive interview with the parent. And when you're interviewing with the school psychologist, give them the information you believe they need to know your child. Depending on the age of the child, we ask the child, we interview teachers, we do observation of the child. There's other measures we can use. We can look at their records, we can look at the skills they have in the classroom that they're exhibiting, all their previous work. It's many, many forms of data collection. The issue continues to be, as we mentioned before, bias. And so a lot of the things I just mentioned comes to interpretation based on the clinician. And if you're doing a parent interview and you're already perceiving this parent in ways that's unfavorable, then the information they're providing to you, you're going to perceive in an unfavorable way. So that's why it's so imperative that educators and clinicians get training and work on becoming less biased.
Yeah.
And really being more reflective on the biases they do hold. We all hold them, regardless of our background. We hold them because we live in the United States and it's a historically racist nation. So we have these biases built into how we're socialized throughout this country, but it's spilling into our work, and in turn, it's harming our students. So that's a big piece. I see a question about how do we screen for trauma. There are tons of trauma screeners. And so you can either Google it or you can email me and I can send you a link to one.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, in talking about the assessments and the biases, that's the thing that came to my mind when you talk about the evaluations and assessments is the report, right? When they create their report and they're interpreting their own data, just looking at, when I read through some of those, the language that is used, some of the quote unquote observations, I've attended meetings where I've asked a psychologist, I'm like, well, how many times did how long did you evaluate this child? How many times? Oh, well, I went to this one class where they were in there and I sat in there for about an hour, and that's how I came up with these observations. Mind you, the class that he went to was the class that the boy was doing the best in anyway. So it's like, as a parent, you also have to ask all of those questions. You have to get to the bottom of how are they creating this information? How are they summarizing this? What are they using? What data points? You want to kind of dig through it to make sure that we're removing some of those biases, right? And that you're bringing it to their attention, because sometimes that's what it takes. And I think that's been an issue across the board, is that these people have been able to create these assessments and to create these summaries, and nobody's questioning what's in it. Like, even in this particular case, he kept trying to throw his degree at me. Well, I've done this and I've been this and I do this, and I don't care. I can read. The bottom line is I can read and I can think for myself, and I know how to ask questions. And I've read enough of these to be able to determine what type of language should be in there. I can now determine what a good one looks like versus a poorly written one. And so, yes, I'm going to call you to action to do this correctly, no matter what your degree says.
And I know I had gotten a comment on when I posted about the stigmas and the microaggressions against Black parents. One of them said when she spoke about the strengths of her child to the evaluator, they told her she was in denial because she spoke about strengths of her child. And these are things that we're talking about that we have to deal with when we are speaking about the strengths, things our children are good at. We're seen as, oh, they're in denial. They don't know what they're talking about. No, listen to us. Listen to us, because those strengths are something you're going to actually need to be using when you're doing interventions with our children. So you might actually want to write them down and make sure that you're listening to them. But as Linda says, yes, so many test reports are so sloppy, names even correct. Yes, I see so much on actual paperwork from the school that it boggles my mind how they have not been sued even more so than they have been. I just don't have any words.
Back to you talking about the strengths, right? That tells us in itself, people's unwillingness to even talk about the strengths talks about, like, shows you their bias right there. So you want to go in only focusing on my child's weaknesses. Well, how are we supposed to build and support if we're not looking at what those strengths are, so that we can use those strengths to build on top of to get them to that next point, right? When we're creating goals and creating these milestones, we need to know what those strengths are so that we can utilize them. And we need to know what, just as much as we need to know what the weaknesses are, so that we can build those weaknesses, right? And put those into strengths, but also know how we need to kind of make up for those weaknesses, right? We need to make sure that we're taking those out of the equation in a sense, and teaching them to their strengths.
And that's one of the things that we mentioned before about what words we use to label and identify and discuss our parents. And so calling a parent in denial is pretty deficit based, and it's not helpful. And so when we are talking about a parent that way, we're already kind of chopping down that bridge that's going to connect the home and the school. And evaluations and being sure to address the strengths, that's a part of our training as school psychologists, because we should be coming in from a strength-based approach, but we also want to know those strengths because we want to know, for example, how did they gain those strengths? Are these strengths based in special interests? How can we use these strengths to fill the gaps of particular deficits? If they are there, well, they probably are there because we all have deficits. And so how can we look at this child as a holistic person? I said this before, from a holistic lens, so that we can have their strengths kind of fill the gaps of their weaknesses.
Exactly.
Part of our training as school psychologists. We just have to remember some of these skills that we were taught and make sure that we use them, especially when we're talking about Black children, because we know there's a lens of bias. I'm like at this point.
But yeah, it is, and when we're thinking about the evaluations, we also need to be thinking about the terms we're using in the evaluations and terms we're using when speaking about the children, because as I was saying, with my 4-year-old son, they were already trying to use the term aggressive with him. So when we're thinking about these terms, we need to be thinking about how we are applying them to the students, especially Black students, and how we're seeing them. Calling my for me, calling my 4-year-old aggressive was just not something that I was going to allow. Knowing that, one, I have a clinical background, and that is not the behavior that he was displaying as a 4-year-old who still has a lot of developing to do, and being compared again as someone who is much older. These are the terms that we have to watch for, even in describing our Black girls and what they're doing within the school system. If they dress a certain way and they see, she's just dressing too grown. Why is she doing that? But a white child can have the same thing on and they're not seen that way. A Black girl can straighten her hair and it's seen as, oh my gosh, she's so grown. Why is she trying to be older than what she is? And a white child can have their hair down and they're not seen like that. These are terms that are constantly used against us. If my child is advocating for themselves within the school system, they will be seen as aggressive or out of line, disrespectful, so many things, when they're actually just trying to advocate for themselves. So it's the terms that we automatically use when it comes to Black children, but don't apply these same terms to their white peers.
Yes. So that's what I was looking at. So I recently had a case where it's an autistic child and the school has refused to take on the autistic diagnosis because they don't want to program for this autistic child. And so he's been suspended and he's been written up. And, if we look at some of the typical behaviors and mannerisms of children with autism, right? When I looked at a lot of the paperwork, it was so typical, right? Mm-hmm. It was like stereotypical at this point, because it's something that you see all the time. And I just want to, as we're talking about the language, I just want to tell you what one of his write-ups says is that the nature of this write-up, one of the things was leave school or classroom without permission. We do know that eloping is something major when it comes to
exactly.
Right. And here's the kicker, guys. It says commits immoral or vicious practices.
That's a right, or is it an option?
No, this is something that they typed in. This is what they have in there. So it says the nature of, and then it has like the first line, and then the second line says commits immoral or vicious practices. This is what they chose to put on this form. And just to give you a little background, he was acting out, mind you. But one of the other words when we talk about language that I pay attention to is that he kept saying that he wanted to escape to such middle school. And so for me, when I was talking to Mom, I said the word escape says a lot to me. It says that wherever he was, he did not feel safe, because you leave places in general, right? You go to other places in general. But when you use a word such as escape, that means that you're trying to get away from something in particular. So again, when we talk about the scenarios and the situations and then the language that is used, there was things, talking about physical aggression and things like that. The physical aggression was against himself. One of the behaviors that was an issue was crying. They named that as one of the issues and behaviors that took place. Well, I wonder why he was crying. Was it because you were yelling at him? Was it because you were pulling on him? Was it because you were being aggressive with him? Is this the reason that he was crying? Is this the reason that things escalated? And so again, that language, when it comes to Black children, no matter what the diagnosis is, they look at our children as aggressors, as dangerous individuals, no matter. And this kid, I think at this time was about 10 when this happened.
Yeah, and I don't understand for the life of me how, it's just, when they're filling out a white student's paperwork, they don't think of any of these terms. And I don't know why, especially even, for people of color who are, working with our children, they don't think about the terms that they're using with our children as well, because I separate Black from people of color. So my child's teacher was a person of color, Malia's teacher, and she wrote on her progress report that she has an issue solving conflicts appropriately. Now, we've all had discussions around her, and we know there's no behavior concern. So when I immediately contacted her, she said, oh, she has internal conflicts within herself. Now, ma'am, let me tell you, when you're writing that on a Black child's paperwork that is in their school file, people aren't seeing that as an internal conflict. That's not even an option. I don't even know why you wrote that on there, because it has nothing to do with anything in this aspect, so the fact that you're writing that and then not giving an explanation, but saying stuff like, oh, it's fine, it's only going to be in her file for elementary school. She's in second grade. She has third, fourth, and fifth to complete. You don't know if I'll leave the school and take her somewhere else. You're not going to be able to explain, this internal conflict that you've talked about with other people. You have to be mindful of the things that you're putting on paper and in students' files when it comes to Black children, because you may be meaning one thing, but people are going to perceive it differently because they're a Black child. So they're going to look at her paperwork and they're going to think, oh, she has aggression issues. She has trouble, interacting with her peers. She can't take it if a conflict happens. What is she going to do? How is she going to respond? So yeah, you guys have to be aware of the language that you're using, not just verbally, but what you're actually writing in paperwork that is going to travel with these students, because they will be looked at differently because of the verbiage that you're using.
Yeah.
Yes. And so like you said, so let's say that you decided that for fourth grade, you wanted to send Malia to a private school. Her grades and everything are there, but they'll look at this language and they'll say, "Oh no, she's a behavior." And I've gone through this with a client where, because the black and white says behavior, they say it doesn't matter that they need us when it comes to the education piece. We can't take students with behavior problems. We don't take those kind of students. So we have to be relentless about taking out that type of language, because it is damning for our children.
Exactly.
And for people who are professionals and working to reduce particular behaviors, it's also not effective. And so when we're looking at particular behavior of concern, we have to define it in a way that's operationally sound. And so when you say, I don't know, I was just frustrated by the immoral and vicious. It took me a while to process that was heavy. But when we talk about those two types of labels, I, as a behavior analyst, have no idea what was observed in the classroom. I still don't know, because that doesn't tell me what happened. And so if we do have a concern, we want to know what happened. What was the behavior you saw? For example, you said there was aggression, and then it came out to be he was hitting himself. And so those are two different things, and how we those are different things. Clearly tell me what happened. And then for us as educators and people who work with children in schools, our next step is, well, what was the message that this particular behavior trying to send? And how are we going to teach another skill so that behavior does no longer occur?
Yes.
And if we're not doing that, and we're attempting to punish or attempting to reduce or identify it in all these harmful ways, then we're not being effective in our work.
And this is true, Linda. Public school files and reports sink kids when they try to get into private schools. Yes, and even if they're just going from elementary school to middle school to high school, these things are harmful to our children, because it gives them just a glimpse of what that teacher's perception was, and when we're thinking about, percentages of race within professions, we are outnumbered in most of them. So, these are mostly people who are not Black writing reports for Black students, so when they're writing these reports, and then our children have to take these reports, to wherever they're going to then be seen by people who are more than likely not Black. And then they're going to have, again, biases, perceptions, stigmas against our children, because they're reading these few lines on a paper, and then they're making their own assumptions about what our children are. Vicious, when I'm thinking vicious, I don't know what to expect, when you're writing these things down there.
And when you said immoral and vicious, I imagined a very big person. And when you said the child was 10, I was frustrated again to hear this is how you're describing a 10-year-old. They've only been on the planet for a decade.
I'm glad you put that up there, Maria, because this same case, I didn't want to say it yet because I knew we were going here, right?
Mm-hmm.
In case, this mother has pictures of bruises around this boy's neck because the school police got involved. So his name is on those reports as someone that got involved with this child. And this mother had to take this boy to the emergency room because the police officer laid hands around this child's neck, where to the point where he had bruises. 10-year-old autistic child. And so, of course, like one of the things, this family is actually in Louisiana. And this mother, of course, is terrified about attempting to send her son back to any school, let alone this school. But again, the options are limited, right? Because let's say they somehow get a windfall of money or whatever and decide, okay, we'll send him to this private school. They're going to see immoral and vicious, aggressive, police interaction. They're going to see all these things on this child's file. So that's the fight right now. So why, again, with a child with autism who is hitting himself, right? So again, from my experience, when I see children with autism, that's something that they typically do if they're upset or frustrated, right? It's too much going on. A lot of them will hit themselves in the head or something like that. But again, that's because of overstimulation. So instead of finding a quiet place for him to de-escalate and come down and minimize, right, those experiences, in the report, it also says the counselor stopped by and tried to help. So the counselor came and removed herself, but then the police officer was the one that dealt with this? Done.
But that is what is common, and that's why we have to talk about police officers in the school system. I know here we did have the school shooting, so I understand why police officers need to be on campus. I do not understand why they need to interact with children, especially Black children, when we know the history of police officers and what and how they treat us as Black people. Again, just now in 2020, people are understanding that police officers are killing us by the droves. That's something a lot of you had just learned. But, there's something that...
So you just said that, with the incidents that's happened in schools, right? I think my issue is that a lot of the issues in schools when it came to school shootings were white schools. Shootings by white students. But yet a heavy police presence is in Black schools and Black neighborhoods with Black students. So again, one of the things, like one of my goals leading into this coming month is to do the research of I need better documentation and reasoning behind why these officers are in these schools. Because if you say to me because of school shootings, it's a problem. It's a problem because they're not in the schools and the type of schools that these shootings were occurring in. They're in our schools, toppling over kids and desks and strangling our children. That's a problem.
Yeah. So I know that they have passed here where there's one in every school here because we did have the school shooting, which is fine if they want to patrol the people coming into the school, or if something goes down, they need to do that. But actually interacting with students, intimidation against students, intimidation against parents. I'm not here for at all, especially knowing that officers lack training across the board. One, on being culturally responsive. Two, on actually interacting with those who have a disability. We know that they're not getting this kind of training. We know that especially when it comes to Black individuals, they're going to be seen as Black first before anything. So I know that if my child was to be, walking in the halls and the police officer stopped her and was asking her, one, she's going to get highly nervous. Two, that may impede with her actual communication with the officer. So he may be expecting an answer and she's going to have a delay in her response. And then again, we're going down this rabbit hole of why you now are doing something to my child. Also, police officers don't need to be handling mental health issues within the school system. Here in Florida, they call the police officers to do Baker Acts for children, which that is an issue in itself, that we're calling the police to send a 4-year-old, 5-year-old, 6-year-old, it's all been in the media, to get handcuffed and then sent to psychiatric treatment. That in itself causes PTSD. I have to be handcuffed, put in the back of a squad car, then taken to the hospital. That is PTSD. You as a mental health practitioner on the campus should be knowing what you need to do. And oftentimes, a Baker Act is not necessary because a child was in there having an overstimulation and threw a couple chairs. So you've now taken that and made it into a suicide attempt or harm attempt against somebody else, when all of that wasn't necessary, because you should have had the proper training to know how to de-escalate the situation, to know how to properly intervene and speak with the child. But calling police officers when we know the history of how they treat Black individuals in itself is harmful. And I don't think that they need to be in the schools dealing with our children.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the things you mentioned was the shooting, unfortunately, that occurred in Florida. And when we look at that particular case, there have been some missteps that we have done as clinical people in school with supporting that particular student. Data has shown, or reports have shown, the student may have been on the autism spectrum, and he did not get adequate mental health services while he was in school. We know that he returned after graduation, but when he was a student, he wasn't given the proper supports. And so it asks, or it calls for proactive practices to be implemented. And how are we supporting students' mental health and their understanding of how to solve conflicts in a way where they're not resorting in gun violence? So that's one. We need to change our funding from installing polices in every school, but really increasing the amount of school counselors and school psychologists and mental health clinicians, social workers who are in schools. Just because I'm a school psychologist, I know the data around school psychologists. Professional organization asks for one school psychologist every 400 kids, but some schools, you have thousands of students and they have one school psychologist. Not working very well at all. And same thing for counselors and our social workers. So that's a big problem. The other issue is when we're noticing a behavior that can escalate to being dangerous, our response should be de-escalation, not escalation. And the issue, we look at children as someone we want to control and get in compliance with, instead of looking at children as people we're in the work of teaching them how to use pro-social skills. And so with the child who is throwing chairs, our goal shouldn't be to just punish the chair throwing, but teach them another way of calming themselves down, asking for support, whatever the behavior is trying to whatever message is trying to send, teach them another way of doing that.
And de-escalation needs to be the key, because even here, I know there were talks of teachers being able to carry concealed weapons here in Florida because of the school shooting. And that is another concern when we're thinking about our Black children, because, it's only going to take one incident of you feeling intimidated by my son, by my daughter, and you shoot them in the school.
Yes.
It's only going to take one incident of that. So I do not even understand why we're going in that direction. I understand us wanting, safety and not wanting these school shootings, but school shootings are not happening by Black children. They're just not. I haven't seen one yet. So, when we're thinking about that, our children are the most at risk when we're thinking about these steps that they're implementing. My child is going to be the most at risk when you're bringing a police officer in there. My child is going to be the most at risk when you're letting teachers now carry concealed weapons. So how are you going to protect my child now that you're adding this in? And the truth of the matter is you haven't, and you're not going to. So then where does that leave me as a parent? It leaves me concerned and worried, because again, if you're bringing in these police officers and we already know they don't have any training, we know you as a school that don't have any training, we know that something is going to go down, and it's going to be with a Black student. You guys need to be, if you're going to have your staff and your teachers trained, you need to be making sure that police officer is getting that training as well, because they're interacting with the students for whatever reason, they're there. So we need to be making sure that they're getting these trainings as well, because they're interacting with our children. And as Linda said, calling the police is an act of aggression. It is against our children. Automatically you calling the police on somebody who is Black, that means you are trying to get me killed. That's how I see it.
So I'm gonna tell you, my children last year, they were in a school that was mostly white, and my son had an incident in the gym where him and a boy were playing. Something happened. One gym teacher came and he was talking to him. And now my kids are tall. My family tends to be tall. So my son, even at 13, 14, he was like 5'8", 5'10", something like that. So while he's talking to the one teacher, his teacher was already not where he was supposed to be. He was in the back talking on his cell phone, and he comes out screaming at my son. And my child is my child. So he said to him, well, why are you screaming at me? Like, I'm already talking to him. We're having a conversation. Like, can we, move past whatever's going on? Like, why are you yelling? And the teacher proceeds to say, I'll call security on you. Keep it up. So when my son said this to me, I just listened. And when we finished having our conversation, I promptly hit my computer and emailed and called the superintendent, the principal, the vice principal, and the counselor. And I said, I need a meeting tomorrow. Mm-hmm. Not 2 days, not 3 days. I will be there in the morning. So be prepared to have a meeting. And they were trying to figure out like what happened. We're not having this conversation over the phone. Mm-hmm. I'm telling you, we're going to have this conversation in person. And I told them, I said, I consider that, like she said, an act of aggression towards my child, because that was a threat. That was an active threat. And I said, the fact that it happened in a school building is so much worse, especially with everything that's happening out there. I said, I'm going to tell you guys, it just came up recently with everything that's going on, that people were saying that the security that's in the school are armed police officers. Mm-hmm. Lord help me, because had I known that at this time, the situation would have been a lot worse. It would have been a lot worse had I known that you not only threatened my child, you threatened him with a gun, as far as I'm concerned, because you knew that person was gun-toting, and I did not. And that would have been an issue had I known my child. I look at that as a threat with a gun, and it would have been turned upside down.
They're supposed to let you know, though, because I know when they brought them into our school, they sent a notice to the parents saying there's a 2-step or 3-step system before they can take it out their holster. But even still, they can get to it, and it's weaponizing against our children. When you're saying something to the point of, I will call the officer on you. I will call security on you. I will call CPS. You know, these are things that you're weaponizing against us because it is fearful for us. It is a fear tactic, is an intimidation tactic. So as schools, you have to be careful what you're using and what you're saying, because for Black people, that is a intimidation and factor, and it's weaponizing your words against us.
Yeah. It is, because data has shown that there are nearly almost 10,000 arrests in school annually. And so these are children who are being arrested for whatever reason. I mean, like you said, Maria, we've seen in Florida, they're as young as 6 years old. There's cases around the country of even 5-year-olds being handcuffed. And so it's not just a phenomenon that's isolated to particular people, because I think sometimes we try to say like it only happens to certain people or it only happened in extreme cases, but that's a big number annually. And once again, that's not a solution to any type of problem that's going to affect meaningful change. And so whatever the concerns are, if we're not teaching a skill, we're not building pro-social behaviors, then we're just creating another type of problem. And like you guys said, that is a threat and it's going to bring harm. When we first heard, and I feel like you two women may have the same feelings I had when I heard that they were going to give teachers handguns, my first thought was Black children are going to die. Native Americans
going to die.
Latinx children are going to die. Children with trauma, children with disabilities are all going to be getting killed at a higher rate, because you're putting a weapon in someone's hand and you haven't even addressed, I'm going to say it again, guys, the implicit bias. The funding for the handgun, I don't know how much it's going to cost because they have to give the handgun and additional training. Right. We can start to invest that capital into training to remove implicit bias, to reduce it, to have conversations about how bias is impacting our work. Also, adding more money to putting mental health clinicians in schools. Paying our teachers more so they're not highly stressed.
Exactly.
Like you said, here it is. The biases have to come first, because again, and people on the outside looking in, again, assume, oh, if this child is handcuffed, if this child is arrested, if this child is shot dead, they had to have done something. And so even in the with my son, right? So his words warranted a police call, which could have warranted, because I'm gonna tell you now, had the police come or whoever would have come and tried to handcuff him, grip him up, or whatever the case may be, he would have resisted, as he should, right? But again, we almost have to go into this mindset and teach our children that they have to allow themselves to be degraded, right, in order to save their own lives. What kind of existence is this? And again, especially when we're talking about in a school building where they're supposed to feel the safest, right? If it's not, it's in the school building. First two places that every child is supposed to feel safe. More guns definitely is not the answer when it comes to Black children feeling safe in schools.
So Erica says, has anyone on the panel looked at the relationship SROs have? As I find school systems that have SROs that are trained and are a part of a system-wide training, she says the Maryland SROs are, that relationship is different. So for us, ours aren't even called SROs at this point. They're actually just police officers. They're one officer from the actual police department that comes to the school and sits there. Some have where they change the department, but the school that my child is at now, it's one particular person that's there every day. But they are not considered an SRO. They are just considered an actual police officer that is on duty, and their training that they get, you know, is still not extensive enough for them to understand Black children, for them to understand children with disabilities. So the training still lacks. And, you know, again, as Molly has stated several times, that implicit bias more than likely has not been addressed. So even when they're interacting with our children, even the parents, because I've seen how the officers even interact with the Black parents at the school with intimidation and being aggressive, actually aggressive. This is where the term actually comes in at, to the parents. So, the training still isn't where it should be for those, at least I know here, for those who are actually supposed to be protecting the school.
Yeah, so when we do look at the data around school resource officers, it varies state to state, county to county, almost school to school. And so some counties, areas call them resource officers, some call them security guards, some are actual police officers. And when I was in DC, I saw the gamut of some schools had police officers, they were Metropolitan Police. Some had security guards from like Allied Security or something like that. And some, I don't think I saw many resource officers. But as Erica's talking about them being embedded in the school, I have not seen that practice. And the research has shown that that is not the typical norm of some resource officers. There have been conversations about resource officers doing really good work, but there's conversation about a lot of them doing harm. And I think the issue is multi-layered. We still have this national problem of how we perceive Black people in this country, and that's going to impact everyone's job: resource officers, teachers, principals, policymakers, all people. But the other issue is how much are we over relying on an officer rather than clinicians, and making sure that we're using trauma-informed approaches. Because we have to acknowledge, especially now, because it's being so highly televised, in a way it wasn't before, that Black children are terrified of police. We're all terrified of police officers. And they can't differentiate between a police officer, a resource officer, and a security guard. They're just terrified.
Exactly. And that again is when with our children coming back into these schools, our Black children who have been witnessing, all of the media surrounding, George Floyd and what has happened, Breonna Taylor, and they're going back into the school system and they're seeing that officer, like Molly said, they're not going to be able to differentiate between if they are this person, or that person. They just know that they're scared and they just don't know what is going to set that officer off, and again, PTSD and having to actually deal with that when they're coming back into the schools. The last thing that we're going to address is the school to prison pipeline. And I know Molly talks about this a lot, so I'm going to let her kick that conversation off.
Yeah, I do talk about this a lot. I guess it's my life's work, right? And so, unfortunately, I know the data very well, but then I also have seen it in action often, which is scary because it happens between preschool all the way up into high school. And I focus my professional career at the preschool level, so 3 and 4-year-olds. And I talked about the data earlier about half of suspensions, expulsion, exclusionary actions in preschool are Black students, but they only represent under 20% of the general population. And there's a study from Yale which looks at how teachers and educators perceive young children. And so they do this really cool study on eye tracking. And they tell the teachers, okay, you're going to observe some students. I want you to tell me who has a problem behavior or who is the problem behavior child. And because they're using eye tracking, they can track where you're looking, which it removes the objectivity of the study, right? And so what they found was when they asked you who's the problem behavior, the teachers often look at Black children. And so when you look for something, you find it. The other issue is that within the same study, none of the children were displaying behaviors of concern. And so they identified they said those students had problem behavior, but there were no problem behaviors actually happening. And so one thing is you're looking at Black children, but you're also seeing things that aren't problem behavior. There's a lot of conversation around, we talked about earlier, the adultification of children and how they're just bigger danger. Howard Stevenson out of the University of Pennsylvania he talks about implicit bias, and he's like, you see them as bigger, closer, more aggressive, more dangerous. And so your reaction is protecting yourself, which is why the implicit bias, it needs to be examined continuously, because when you're in protection mode, you're going to have these different type of reactions. That's when you're calling security, you're calling police officers, and then they come with their additional lenses of bias. So that's a big crisis that we are facing currently in schools, and unfortunately it's starting at preschool and it's continuing up. I mean, even if we look at the data around preschool suspension and expulsion and exclusion, kids are being kicked out of school, really young children. You're more likely to be excluded from school in preschool than you are in high school. And so it is a huge problem. I know, Maria, you and I were in a call, and I was talking about this with someone, and they were saying, well, what about those students that bring guns and knives to schools? And when we look at the data, so I know this probably is boring because I'm always like, the data, but behavior analyst.
No, give us the facts.
And we love data. But the data shows that less than 2% of school suspensions are even for violent offenses. We know children are being suspended or excluded for like dress code. I remember I saw my niece one day, and she had these jeans with big holes in them. And I was just shocked she didn't get suspended, because I read so much data. I'm just expecting her to get suspended for having holes in her jeans.
Exactly. Our hair is a big one as well. Why we're getting suspended. The hair that grows out of our head, that we have to now have laws for to just have the hair that grows out of our head. So like you're saying, it's not all even half, a third of students who are doing something that is actually violent. It's just
that's
But wait.
And I had
Can I run back on that real quick though?
Sure.
Because what's the other piece of bringing weapons to school that is not addressed? So again, I had a client who brought a weapon to school. Why? Because the previous week, his brother got jumped and somebody pulled a knife on him and all of that. So for him, his brother now was not there, couldn't walk him to school, and now he's walking to school by himself. So in his mind, now I need to protect myself. So again, the full picture is not looked at. And again, that's one of those situations where I go in, I'm like, you're not suspending this child for, again, let's get to the bottom of what it is. Because these kids still have to walk through these neighborhoods where violence is occurring from day through the night. And so they feel scared, frustrated, and everything else. And again, a lot of these kids are going to and from school by themselves, and they have to protect themselves in their minds. So what do? So even when we look at the weapons, okay, they brought a weapon. Let's get to the bottom of it. Are you going to send buses for them to pick them up from school? Are y'all going to send school staff throughout the neighborhood to walk them to school to keep them safe? Let's look at what the other options are.
Yeah, those preventative factors. So I saw that someone asked about the weapons. The data around like less than 2% of students are found with weapons is from pre-K to 12. So it's not just preschoolers. And so I doubt it's preschoolers bringing in this data. But like when I talk about suspension, those are some of the questions that came up. So I like to, once I get those type of questions, have a response already, because I'm very proactive. I talked about that earlier. We need to be very, very proactive. One of the other things that people talked about was so there's a call for not suspending children in a lot of places. There's a lot of laws because of the disproportionality of school suspension. This response has been, don't suspend. And when you look at the data, suspension is actually not effective in reducing the behaviors we don't want to see. What we know effective is positive behavior intervention supports. So my call for action is really to implement those type of strategies. But at the same time, I must say, first step is address implicit bias and anti-Blackness in schools, and then built in a positive behavior support system in the schools. Yeah, suspension is not an intervention. It's not. It's not effective. It's not an intervention. It's not working right now, but we're continuing to. So build in a system that encourages the pro-social behaviors that you're hoping to see, that acknowledges, like Naomi mentioned, some of the community violence that may be contributing, or maybe there are some deficits in language and in communication with peers or with adults. There's a lot of concerns that may be present behind the behavior that you're seeing. Acknowledge all of those first is definitely the answer. For all the schools on the call, NAS just had a call or put out a framework for school discipline and how to respond to all of the problem behaviors that we're seeing in school. But the first action must be, and NAS did not acknowledge it first, but I'm saying it's first, we have to acknowledge how we view children and implement effective behavior support, which is why I became a behavior analyst. I was a school psychologist and I was like, I think I need to know behavior a little bit better. And then for some reason I signed up for like 2 more years of school. 1,500 hours of supervision, but it was worth it. Knowing how to shift behavior is what we need in school. Yeah, and it must be consistent. Yes, Joy.
And we also need to talk about misdiagnosis across the board for our children and how that sets up and leads for the school to prison pipeline. You know, if my child is misdiagnosed, not diagnosed, they're not getting the appropriate interventions. And because of that, they're going to be seen as a certain way. They're going to be treated a certain way when they're not given the even acknowledged as having a categorization, a diagnosis. They're just looked at as a problem child. This is the behavior. And now let's go ahead and ship them off where they need to go, which is prison, you know? So we have to address the fact that we are, again, misdiagnosing Black children, again, not diagnosing Black children, not listening to Black children. So this is setting them up for the school to prison pipeline.
Yes. And so many, again, they're looked at as a bad child. So that's one of the things that has always bothered me, is that when you look at someone that is 5, when you look at someone that's 10 and you write them off as just a bad person. Again, I just have so many experiences. I had one case, he wasn't even my case, actually. There was this kid that was in one of my kids' classes. And again, his behavior was just, he picked with everybody. He was very, very defiant, all of this going on. So the one day I'm in the cafeteria and I told him, I said, keep it up. I'm going to have you come sit with me. He's like, can I? I was like, yeah, come on. Come on. So we sat and we ate and we talked, and his personality was just so different just in that one-on-one, right? And then after that, he came back the next time I was sitting there, and he came and sat with me. And I said, you know what? See, you do have good behaviors. You do know how to act. I said, you're great. He's like, no. He said, I'm evil. And I said, no, you're not. No, seriously, I got the devil in me. No. I said, the behaviors are there. I said, but you're showing me right now that you can do it. And he was just kind of looking at me like, trying to figure it out, like, okay, I hear what you're saying. But again, how many more people does he need to hear that from before it cancels out all the negative that he's heard in his very young life, right? We're talking maybe 3rd grade. And again, if he continues to hear, you're evil, you're bad, you're evil, you're no good, you'll never amount to anything, school to prison pipeline, right? Definitely. If he feels that there's no good inside of him, I can't act right. That's what he told me. I can't act right. And again, he's saying this to me, right? So that's even another step, is that he's able to communicate his self-image at this point. But again, I'm not in a position. That's something that now has to be pushed to the next person. There has to be a process within the school buildings. Years back, that was my job. is that when teachers had their meetings and talked about different children and their behaviors, they would give us, who were the behavioral health agency inside the schools, the referral. We would go talk to the parents, we would do the intake, and then we would refer them to other services, grief therapy, counseling, or whatever, so that they get what they need. We go into the homes, we find out they need food, any of these things to help support the child, as Molly said earlier, holistically. That has to be the approach, holistically.
Yeah, when you look at the individuals who are currently incarcerated through the juvenile system or the penal system, there are a lot of individuals there who either had a disability or have experienced high trauma or went undiagnosed. And so another resource is a book, which is, everyone's talking about it now because it became a movie, Just Mercy. I didn't see the movie, but I would recommend everyone read that book because he talks about how many of those children who were actually on death row, what he's talking about, have high trauma exposure, have difficulties in some of the academic skills they need, or may have processing difficulties, or may be intellectually disabled, or just have some type of different ability, and how maybe they slip through the cracks of the school system or were misdiagnosed or incorrectly diagnosed. That's a huge issue Maria often talks about, and how it leads to a trajectory that is not hopeful. We also talked about that particular category. There's 13 categories within special education. It differs depending on your state, but IDEA says there's 13. And the one that is the most impactful for children is that emotional disturbance category. It really leads to some serious outcomes. And so that's one of the diagnoses. Well, it's not diagnoses, it's a category, but that's one of the categories that we really need to look at. And we know that children are disproportionately placed in that category. And so just think about the connection. They're more likely to be put in that category, and it has the most harmful outcomes. We got to look at that data.
Yeah, and that one is the one that grinds my gears the most, because oftentimes they could very well be put in the OHI category rather than that category, which, leads them to being in a specific classroom, being dealt a certain curriculum just because they're in that category. So Erica says, my SLP's husband is a corrections officer. He said many incarcerated are young men with disabilities. Most definitely. Most definitely that did not get the diagnosis. Most definitely were misdiagnosed or, just looked over. This is a huge problem that we have to address, especially when it comes to our Black youth, because they're the most impacted by this.
I have a statistic for that. Sorry to throw out all these numbers, but I was
throw it out there.
I had a friend who worked in the juvenile justice system in DC, and the data he provided me was 85% of the students within his juvenile detention center had an IEP. That's high, and so that's a huge problem because children with IEPs have a disability that is known. So how are we supporting them to make sure they're not ending up in the juvenile justice system?
Yeah, and the truth of the matter is we're failing our children and we're failing their families. We're just across the board, we're failing them. We're failing our Black families because of the perceptions that we have against them, that, like we were saying, the fight is 10 times as hard for me to get services for my child, to get a categorization for my child. The system is set up against us in many ways. If I have to think about feeding my child and keeping a roof over my head versus going to an IEP meeting, I'm going to do that. But in the same instance, as a Black parent, I'm looked at somebody who doesn't care about my child. We have to get through all of these barriers just to make sure that our kids get some sort of I don't even know if I want to call it justice within the school system, because it's not, because they're still left at a disadvantage. So it brings us to, what do we do next? Yes, we're up here talking and we're talking about, all the issues that our children and families have to deal with, but what is next? What are actionable steps that you as viewers can take and then do to use to make sure your school is anti-racist, because that's the goal here. The goal is to make sure your school is anti-racist, to make sure that your school is going to provide justice to the Black students and families. So the three of us have curated a guide that is very informative, that I think is very informative, and I love it, that you all can actually get. And it's a free guide that you can get. So if you just text schools to 33777, you will get this guide that has all of the actionable steps of what's next. What is the next thing that we do now? What we've had this conversation, but we don't want to leave it as a conversation, because I'm all about actionable steps. That's the therapist in me. We got to do something with this information. We're just not going to talk about it. So we need to make sure that we're now taking this conversation that you've had here with us, things you've learned here with us about how our students and families are treated. And now you take this information and you challenge your schools to do better. You challenge your communities to do better, because that's what we need. We know, as I said again, for those of you who have, just found out racism exists in 2020. Now I want you to take this information and I want you to do something with it, because us as Black people, we've known this is how we've been treated, and while I am happy that it is finally having a light shined upon, I'm still hurt by the fact that it's taken this long. I'm hurt by the fact that I, as a Black mom, am scared of my children going anywhere without me. I'm scared that my child who is autistic is going to have any interaction with anybody who doesn't understand her disability, and she's going to be at risk. I'm fearful of being shot in front of my child. These are fears that we deal with every day. And now that there's a light being shined upon it, let's do something about it. Let's use this momentum and create change. And thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
I was just so hungry for more. Like, yes. No, I love what you said, because these conversations are not beneficial unless we do actionable change. And I think currently, with the current state of the country where we're talking about this more, I am not saying this for people's entertainment, for people to be like, oh, this is great, I love hearing you talk. No, I want you to change your behavior now. And do something differently, because what we're currently doing is not working. And it's particularly
not at all
for Black children. And it leads to poor outcomes for Black adults. And so definitely do some change, definitely decolonize your curriculum, address those implicit biases. We all have them, regardless of our socioeconomic status, our racial makeup, our ethnic makeup. We all have them. And so we need to do the work actively all day, every single day, of addressing implicit bias and anti-Blackness.
Yes. Lazier, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. If not, please forgive me. Do you think establishing a panel or group of Black parents of autistic kids is a good idea? Or do you know any out there to focus more on our issues? I always am pro Black most anything that's going to lead in a good direction. I think that as Black parents parenting a child who is autistic, our experiences are extremely different. People don't understand us, and we're often left out of important conversations when it comes to us and our children. So I definitely think that establishing a panel or group of Black parents, is a great idea. It's something that I do, within Autism in Black, and then we work behind the scenes to change policies, to lobby to make sure that our children are more protected than what they are now. As we all know, this is what I do, and I stand on my soapbox and preach all day about how it is so different for us. So I'm always going to be pro you advocating and lobbying and making policy changes for Black autistic children, students, because it's going to be helpful for my child and anybody else's child. Let's see. It says, you surely can. I actually know Camille with The Color of Autism. Great foundation, great woman. I love everything that she does with The Color of Autism. Look, Melinda already on it. She already texted and got her email. Use the guide, Melinda. Use the guide.
Yeah, I definitely think
said that too.
Use the guide.
What were you saying, Molly?
Oh yeah, definitely use the guide. There's a lot of important resources in there. So definitely read it.
Yes, agree, Erica. You do not see. We are not represented well. We are often forgot. I mean, the disability community as a whole is often forgot from these conversations. We've been having conversations about protecting our children, and people have been forgetting about children who are who have disabilities, because our conversations are completely different. My conversation with my child who is autistic and has a comprehension issue is completely different from the conversation that I have with my other child who is neurotypical and doesn't have a comprehension issue, you know. So I can't have that same conversation with, you know, my children. It has to be different, and we're often left out of these conversations. Parents don't have resources to be able to know how to talk to their children about what is going on, because like I said, you know, our children are going to be coming back into these schools. It's going to be talked about. They're going to be dealing with issues, and if we haven't had these conversations, you know, our children are at a disadvantage. And it's not our fault that we don't know how to have the conversations when nobody is giving us resources on how to have the conversation. Yeah. You know, we cannot apply everything to our children. Sometimes it does have to be specialized and specific to them, which is why I created the platform, you know, of Autism in Black to provide that resource, because we're often forgot about. And it's something that, you know, as you can see, I get very passionate about and want to talk and talk and talk about. But you have to know that's what they're gonna say. They're gonna say I'm very aggressive, and don't forget to tell me about that check that I can get.
But you have to be, right? So we look at the numbers around people with autism who are harmed by other people. Yes. Crazy number, right? But then you put the intersectionality around being Black with autism.
Yeah.
We talk about children with their hands. I mean, when the police are interacting, you're not supposed to move. They're moving. They don't have vocal language, so maybe they use sign, and that's, we know people who are deaf or use ASL, how often they're harmed by police officers because they're misunderstanding how they're communicating with their, I mean, there's so many things that we have to consider for all of these communities. We have to talk about Black people with autism.
Exactly. Yeah. And our community has to not be ashamed to talk about Black autistic individuals, because there's no shame in it, you know. So we have to be more vocal about advocating, and we have to let those who are autistic Black individuals advocate for themselves as well and listen to them. You know, I advocate for my daughter, and I teach her how to advocate for herself. So that's what we need to be making sure we're doing as well. Erica, you can text schools to 33777 and you can get the guide. Yes, the case of Elijah McClain is just extremely sad. It's just sad. And it's a fear that all of us worry about. You know, those who have children with disabilities, that is a real fear that we have to face. You know, it's something that will keep me up at night if I worry too much about it. And my child is 8. You know, she's not going too many places without me, but it's something that I'm concerned about even now, of how am I going to deal with giving her independence as an individual, but also trying to make sure that she's safe. You know, that's something that we as Black parents have to be concerned with, because every time our child steps out that door, they are at risk of not coming home. And that is a reality for us, you know, so that's what talk you guys' head off.
Yeah, no, that case definitely broke my heart before I even knew the details. Just reading his responses, you know, my first thing was I said, I don't even know if this person had a disability. I said, but listening to the language, it put me in the mindset of a high functioning autistic person. So again, I was nowhere near that scenario, nowhere near that situation, but just reading it said that to me. And I feel like that's what people need to have, right? So teachers, officers, anybody interacting with individuals, whether and it is in any capacity. Individuals, when you have to deal with people, you should understand people and you should be able to pick up those types of characteristics and say, you know what, I need to handle this situation differently. I need to notice that this person is a little different and I have to deal with them accordingly. So again, grabbing, touching, all these things are heightening the situation versus de-escalating. And it is actually, it's so nauseating. It was so nauseating to read.
It's very troubling.
So,
very.
Said, I'm different. I have different and as a person who works with children with autism, particularly, we teach Black children with autism to say, I have autism. I may not follow all your directions. I don't communicate in the same way, as a way to like indicate to police, I have a disability. But he was trying, I don't think anyone trained him to, but he was trying to say, like, I'm different, advocate for himself, and it wasn't effective because of the person who was listening, or should we say not listening. And
exactly.
So as professionals who interact with the community, we need to be more responsible in how we interact with these individuals. And then we also need to acknowledge that when we have clients who their parents are, so we have programs that we may run that's desensitization. I have Black parents who do not want to run those in the community for reasons that make perfect sense. Because you cannot have a tantrum or over escalation in the community for obvious reasons. And so just being mindful of that, just being knowledgeable about how things feel for people who have been continuously marginalized in this.
And the fact that we as Black people have to disclose diagnoses just for you to treat us as human beings and treat us with a little humanity before you automatically escalate to killing us is just wrong in itself. I should not have to disclose, to somebody I don't know, my diagnosis just so you won't kill me. The fact that we have to do that is a problem in itself, and it shows that we lack training across the board when it comes to our police officers, our school staff, anybody that we have to disclose this information to, for you then to stop and take a moment to understand us. And that's an issue in itself. Yes. So we are going to wrap up here. I want to thank everybody for joining us for 2 hours. I want to thank you for dealing with my very problematic technical issues, but we got through it. Shout out to my husband, who was my technical advisor, who was running up here to make sure that you guys could hear and see me, and me hear and see you, because that was the issue. But thank you for sitting through that and getting this great information from us. Thank you for getting the guide and thinking that it's already great, because I see all of you commenting saying it's a great guide. And make sure to text schools to 33777 to get your guide. Don't worry if you missed the beginning, it's going to stay up on the page, so you'll be able to watch the replay. And all of our information on how to contact us is also in the guide. So reach out to us if you have any questions or you want to set up an appointment. And thank you all for joining us tonight. You could have been doing something else, but you were sitting here listening with us. So we thank you for that. So catch us at another time. We'll probably do another talk on something else. So make sure to stay on the page and watch out for any announcements that we make in the future. So thank you all and have a good evening. You two ladies still stay on so we can wrap up. But thank you all and have a great evening.
Someone asked me,
good night,
friends, definitely. Send the
share with everybody.
Yeah.
Anybody who needs it, make sure to share it with them. They can text the schools to 33777 and they can get it as well.
Yeah.
Have a good one, everyone.
Good night.
I do not know when my next talk is, but stay tuned to the page and you'll see an announcement. Have a good night.